In the heart of Rome stands one of the most fascinating monuments in the history of Christianism, St. Peter's Basilica. It was allegedly built on the very spot where Jesus' most famous apostle was martyred and buried. And in the depths of this massive church is perhaps kept the Vatican's greatest treasure, which also is an incredible mystery that has fascinated researchers for centuries, St. Peter's relics.
The bones that were found there were the authentic bones of Peter. We can't know that.
Despite the doubts they generate, these relics are key for the Vatican. Indeed, St. Peter is considered the very first pope, the first of an uninterrupted line until today.
He is regarded as a foundation stone, so to speak, of the papacy, of the Catholic Church.
Peter's relics are politics. They're used to enforce the Pope's authority.
But does his tomb truly lie under St. Peter's Basilica, as the Vatican suggests? Did he even die in Rome? For 2 millennia, the true story of St. Peter has been subject to controversy.
We're not absolutely 100% certain that Peter ever came to Rome, so that makes the existence of the bones slightly problematic.
But beyond the relics, the Prince of the Apostles is also a very mysterious character, able to both betray Jesus and yet become the new head of Christianism. During the last couple of years, the quest to discover the true St. Peter has seen unexpected developments. Archaeological excavations in Israel have given important clues to help solve the riddle behind his place of birth, the legendary city of Bethsaida.
This reliquary goes very well with the description that this is the village of the 3 apostles.
In Rome, new bones have been found more than 3 kilometers away from the Vatican, a new twist in the adventure of St. Peter's relics.
You see, there's Petrus written. When I saw this, I felt we had found a great treasure.
From Israel to Rome and through Turkey, we have to follow in St. Peter's tracks to find out historical and archaeological clues he left behind, in the hope of finally solving his many mysteries. Our investigation begins at St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. This is where the tomb of the Prince of the Apostles is traditionally believed to lie. The basilica was built during the 4th century and completely rebuilt during the Renaissance. This colossal building has been standing as the center of the Catholic world for more than 1,000 years.
I think the Basilica of St. Peter in Rome is of paramount importance for the Christian Church. It remains as a monument, really, to the most important of Jesus' disciples.
Everything in the Basilica reminds us of St. Peter's presence. In the middle of the plaza stands a 130-meter-high obelisk, which supposedly witnessed the Apostles' martyr in 64 AD. At the end of the nave is Peter's pulpit. According to tradition, this is the chair Jesus' disciples sat in as the first pope.
This is a fascinating location because it's theatrical. It's the end of the Renaissance. We want to show the power of the church and especially the symbol of Peter.
But St. Peter's tomb is the center of all the theatricals. 3 magnificent monuments in the Basilica have been honoring the very location of the tomb for 5 centuries. An immense cupola rises 150 meters above ground, the second highest dome in the Christian world. Right below it, at ground level, there's a huge canopy as tall as a 10-story building, right in the middle of the Basilica. Below, there's the Chapel of Confession, decorated with marble and bronze. Only the Pope is allowed to enter. Finally, In the depths of the Basilica, 7 meters underground, there's a mysterious funeral monument from the 2nd century that has long been buried under the Basilica's foundations and was only discovered in 1940.
There was a strong expectation there might be some kind of bones or some kind of a tomb there, but it was by far from clear.
St. Peter's tomb had been lost for centuries, and yet seemed to have been found precisely where it should have been, in line with the Basilica's architectural structures. Then, after more excavations full of turns and twists, bones were finally discovered inside the tomb. This is the perfect epilogue for the Vatican.
Because of the importance of Peter for papal authority, finding the bones of Peter or anything to do with Peter would have enhanced or buttressed the claims of the papal establishment.
In November 2013, Pope Francis shows St. Peter's relics to the assembled crowd for the very first time, 60 years after their discovery below the Basilica. This is a historical moment.
This is a very surprising moment, because for the first time we can see the relics of the Apostle St. Peter. We knew they existed, but no one except archaeologists and the various popes, perhaps, had seen them.
Inside this bronze case are exposed the various bone fragments that supposedly belong to St. Peter, relics that have been incredibly important for believers throughout the centuries.
Faith is not enough. We like souvenirs, and of course saint relics are the ultimate souvenir.
They seem to have even been seen as being inhabited by sort of divine power.
But do these bones truly belong to St. Peter? Is the Prince of the Apostles truly buried in such a theatrical tomb, right where tradition speculated they would be? Doubts continuously surface since they have been discovered.
Were they Peter's bones? Were they somebody else's bones? Again, we can't know for sure.
We can't know for sure, especially since the bones haven't been dated yet. In 2014, 3 kilometers away, the quest for St. Peter's relics starts anew, after the unexpected discovery of remains that also could have belonged to him. Massimiliano Floridi belongs to a very old family from the Roman nobility. He witnessed this discovery in an unexpected place. Far away from the luxury of St. Peter's Basilica, the last twist in the quest for St. Peter's relics took place in a modest church in Rome. In 2014, the 1,000-year-old church of Santa Maria in Capella is undergoing restoration work. That's when the workers discovered something peculiar near the altar.
We were quite surprised when we discovered that the altar was hollow, and inside the hole we found 2 terracotta pots that looked very old indeed.
One of the 2 pots catches his eye immediately. On the lid are carved the names of the very first popes in history: Anastasius, Cornelius, and the most famous of them all, Peter.
The most amazing thing is that we can see the name of Peter here. You see, there's Petrus written. When I saw this, I was really excited. I felt we had found a great treasure.
Inside the urns, Massimiliano Floridi discovered many bone fragments, which are now sealed away.
There were many bone fragments. I don't know what part of the body they belonged to, but they were clearly human.
The discovery was like a shockwave. If these bones are indeed St. Peter's, then who's the man resting under the Vatican? In order to understand how these mysterious urns have been hidden here, the owner of the church called upon an archaeologist to study the building closely. The Santa Maria in Capella church is rather peculiar. Tombs and bones from the Middle Ages were found there, and many paintings and statues representing St. Peter can be found everywhere. However, what archaeologist Cristiano Mengarelli finds most fascinating is mysterious writing at the entrance of the church.
The history of the church wasn't really known.
And it was the same for the writing. Researchers known about it, but they never studied it closely.
The carved marble dates back to the foundation of the church in 1090. It refers to relics, along with several popes and martyrs. We can also see the letters PET, which is an abbreviation sometimes used for Petrus in Latin, or Peter in English.
The name of every saint mentioned in the writing were found on the relics, or rather, on the lid of the urns. Every name matched. And so we deduced that the writing and the reliquary were reliable.
The relics of Santa Maria in Capella were considered authentic by believers during the Middle Ages. But is that correct? How could the bones of the first pope in history, Jesus' apostle, end up in this small church in Rome? By studying the writing closely, we can see a date, 1090. And there's a name too, Pope Urban II. And so, the Pope himself put the relics there. And Urban II isn't just any Pope. He's very charismatic, and will call for the First Crusade in 1095. Yet these are troubled times for the papacy, as another pope is questioning his power over the Christian world. Urban II found a solution to enforce his legitimacy in Rome: St. Peter's relics.
He who used the image of St. Peter to tell the world that he was the only true Pope. That he who owns St. Peter's relics is obviously the person in charge of leading the Church of Rome.
If someone was ever able to access the bones of St. Peter, it was probably the Pope. But was he truly able to steal the bones from the tomb of the Vatican, or are these relics fake, used by Urban II in his quest for power? In order to be sure, Massimiliano Faridi wanted the bones from Santa Maria in Capella to be analyzed in a laboratory, yet his request was quickly blocked by the Vatican's veto.
Since we're in Rome, we have to await the decision from the Pope and his curates. And they chose to prevent an analysis from taking place.
Such analysis could indeed prove embarrassing for the Vatican, because if these are indeed the true relics of St. Peter, then the authenticity of the bones the Pope presented could very well be questioned. But why are St. Peter's relics such an important stake for the papacy? And how could this modest fisherman from Galilee, the one who denied Jesus, become so important in the history of Christianism? It seems we'll have to decipher the unique relationship between Jesus and St. Peter as told by the Bible. More than 3,000 kilometers away from Rome, Peter grew up in Galilee, in the north of Israel, near Lake Tiberias to be precise. The Bible tells us that Peter was a fisherman, along with his brother Andrew.
He was, basically a Galilean type fellow until he met Jesus.
Just like other apostles, Peter leaves his work and home behind in order to follow Jesus. Peter is completely involved in this because Jews at the time were waiting for the Messiah. A Messiah that was the Son of God, but also a political leader.
The land of Israel was under Roman occupation. They wanted to be free, and they expected that the Messiah would free them.
Peter, like other Jews, is hoping for is a kind of a Messiah figure, someone anointed by God to do his purpose.
During the 3 years before the death of Jesus, Peter quickly becomes the leader of the apostles. He is quoted more often in the Bible than all other apostles together, and his charisma makes him the ideal spokesperson.
There's clearly a very close personal relationship between Jesus and Peter. Peter is utterly devoted to Jesus and will do anything for him.
The Gospel tells us that Jesus, in return, gives Peter a very important power that will truly make him the Prince of the Apostles. That power is symbolized by keys that Peter is often represented holding in his hand. These are the keys to heaven.
It'll become some kind of popular tradition. Peter as the doormat of heaven, someone who opens and closes the door to paradise. But that's not what the text is about.
The Bible gives a much more mysterious explanation of this power. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Through this enigmatic formulation, Jesus bestows upon Peter a huge responsibility: to judge souls, to forgive sins, or to condemn to hell for all eternity.
If you forgive somebody the sins, heaven will forgive them, and if you don't, heaven will not forgive them. So it is that Jesus gave Peter a very, very dominant and important role in amongst the disciples.
In order to mark this key event in Peter's destiny, Jesus will give the Prince of the Apostles a new name, the name we know today.
Peter isn't named Peter. We have to say it at some point. Peter isn't called Peter, he's called Simon, and Jesus is the one who gives Simon the name of Peter.
Jesus is pictured as giving a nickname. I suppose we would say Rocky or something of that nature today.
Jesus comes up with this name because he sees the leader of the apostles as a rock he can rest upon, and also the founding stone of the new religion, Christianity.
The famous saying in Petros, your rock, and upon this rock I will build my church, etc., has been one of the most controverted texts in the entire Bible.
Protestants and Catholics will tear each other apart for centuries regarding the interpretation of this ambiguous sentence. Catholics believe this sentence enforces the idea of a hierarchy, of a church with a leader designated by Jesus himself.
The church that owns the relics of St. Peter, which is the Church of Rome, will see itself as the heir of Peter himself, and the Pope is Peter's successor.
And that's why representations of St. Peter, the first Pope, can be found everywhere in the Vatican, and also why the Apostles' relics have been key for the last 2,000 years in justifying Rome's place at the center of Christianism.
The city of Rome used Peter in its bid for power, in its bid for political power.
The symbol of the Prince of the Apostles has often been used by the Church throughout the centuries. But what do we know exactly about the real St. Peter, and where did he grow up? His city of birth, Bethsaida, is another riddle that has fascinated researchers. Indeed, archaeologists have been looking for the location of this lost city for 2 centuries without success. However, since 2016, new discoveries have potentially uncovered the place. According to the Bible, St. Peter was born in Bethsaida, in the north of Israel, a city very close to Lake Tiberias. This is also the birthplace of 2 other apostles, Andrew and Philip. However, for over 1,000 years, the city has been abandoned and its ruins buried underground. Estelle Villeneuve tracked the archaeological quest to the various holy places from the Bible, and Bethsaida is indeed one of the last riddles.
When looking for Jerusalem, we know where it is, that's for sure. But other locations, such as Bethsaida, completely vanished. There's no village called Bethsaida anymore. So where was it?
The Bible locates Bethsaida in the north of Lake Tiberias in Israel, but archaeologists never managed to agree on the exact location. However, everything changes when, during the 80s, a team of archaeologists identifies a promising site east of the Jordan River, Et Tel. A massive excavation is organized, and after 10 years of work, they successfully unearthed the ruins of a village.
We found remains from the Roman period, including houses in which we found fishing equipment. So we can conclude that there were fishermen living in Et Tel.
So there was indeed a village where fishermen lived. And that's all it took to officially identify the place as Bethsaida. But is this truly St. Peter's birthplace? For years, one archaeologist had his doubts, because Et Tel is 2 kilometers away from the shore.
The name of Bethsaida means the house of the fishermen. It makes much more logic to assume that a village named the house of the fishermen will be on the shore of the lake.
Mordecai Aviam is convinced that the remains of Bethsaida lie elsewhere. Since 2016, he's been doing research on another site, called El Araj, and located 2 kilometers away from Et Tel, much closer to the shore, and discoveries have been piling up.
And this is a mosaic from the Roman period, probably from a Roman bathhouse. That is something very typical to urban centers rather than to rural villages.
These remains of a Roman bathhouse were found exactly here, 4 meters underground. The archaeologist sees it as a key clue. Ancient texts say that Bethsaida was promoted to the rank of Roman city during the 1st century, which was a rare occurrence in the region. But in order to be sure that these are indeed the remains of St. Peter's city, Mordecai Aviam is looking for another major clue, the signs of a church mentioned in a text from the 8th century.
In the beginning of the 8th century, a traveler by the name of Willibald, wandering for the holy sites in Galilee following Jesus, and on the way he says he crosses Bethsaida, and there is a church for the apostles.
For almost 1,000 years, we had lost track of this church built to honor the 3 apostles. It almost seemed like a legend, but Mordecai Aviam discovered a fragment of marble that was buried. It may not look like much, but it could turn out to be the long-awaited proof.
We have here a piece of marble from a Byzantine period chancel screen, and it was a large table, was standing like this. There's no doubt we have here the remains of a church.
The ruins of the walls supposedly belong to a monastery next to the church. It will take several more years of careful excavations to fully uncover the building. But more surprises await the archaeologist. During the summer of 2018, he discovered a piece of carved rock that he believes to be a reliquary, more than 1,300 years old.
Its design makes it very clear to me that what we have here is a reliquary. It is divided into 3 boxes, and it goes very well with the description that this is the village of the 3 apostles, Peter, Philip, and Andrew.
At the time, reliquaries were indeed often carved in stones, and so each of the 3 cavities was perhaps used to expose a relic from each of the 3 apostles of Bethsaida, Peter, Philip, and Andrew. But what relic from St. Peter could the faithful worship here, more than 3,000 kilometers away from the Vatican?
And people in the Holy Land cannot go to Rome to see St. Peter's tomb, so anything that has to do with the person itself can be in the reliquary, not necessarily bones.
Was this reliquary used to keep an important item that belonged to St. Peter? We'll have to wait for more excavations in the years to come if we want to know more on the subject. However, the clues found so far already seem to indicate that this is indeed the original Bethsaida. The discovery of a Roman bathhouse, the remains of a church, and the reliquary match perfectly what we know about St. Peter's city from historical sources. Three years have passed since Peter met Jesus. We are now in Jerusalem on the day before the crucifixion. Standing above the city, the Church of St. Peter in Gallicantu commemorates the darkest moment in the life of St. Peter right after Christ was arrested.
This church is here to commemorate the judgment of Jesus by the high priest, who will sentence him to death, and also the place where Peter, who followed Jesus, will deny him 3 times.
The current church was built in the beginning of the 20th century on the ground where Jesus was lightly judged. and St. Peter denied him. The house of the high priest Caiaphas. Starting during the 5th century, 4 sanctuaries have been built here one after another. It shows just how much that event in the Bible has left a mark on the faithful. In the depths of the church, a holy place has been preserved throughout the centuries. This is the prison, where Jesus was supposedly locked in the last night before his death. The only access at the time was through this hole, and he was probably brought down from there.
Around the hole we can see 3 crosses carved in the stone. They probably indicate that the person brought through that hole was the Christ. And these crosses date back to the construction of the church in the year 450 AD.
And just as Jesus was being locked in here, right outside the house in this courtyard, Peter's betrayal happened.
And there were some women, and they heard him talking to other people and said, "Oh, your accent sounds like you are like one of them who was with Jesus." And then Peter said, "I don't know this man." And he said it 3 times.
He actually seems to pronounce a curse upon Jesus, be cursed, in some sense. So it's a pretty profound denial.
And so, Peter abandons his master right before his death on the cross. This event clearly shows the contradictions within the apostle, and a personality that isn't as strong as one could imagine.
He's quite impetuous, he rushes into things, but sometimes he loses his courage and he's not quite as good as he thinks he is.
He is not a perfect person. Jesus is perfect, but Peter is not.
The denial could have been an abrupt end to St. Peter's destiny. But on the contrary, this will show him as a human character with weaknesses that many Christians will be able to identify with throughout the centuries.
Perhaps in a way that's the point, that it's not somebody who's perfect, it's somebody who has failed but still picked himself up and tried again. So Peter, in a way, is like all of us.
After Jesus' death, St. Peter will have to face his weaknesses in order to carry out the mission he was given, to create Christianism.
And it's really Peter who starts the whole missionary activity, and so he plays a crucial part in the very earliest spread of Christianity.
Within 30 years, what was but a small local and trivial movement will spread to the east and all around the Mediterranean Sea. Christianization has started and will deeply change the face of the world.
Look what happened. Billions and billions of people believe in Jesus Christ today, and it all started from this little Jewish sect.
In order to fulfill his destiny as the new head of Christianism, tradition tells us that St. Peter went to Rome to spread the religion.
This is the city to conquer. Once you're in Rome, you're at the heart of the Roman Empire.
I think at some point, everybody would have thought, we've got to go to Rome.
Throughout the centuries, the Vatican based all its power on the visit and death of St. Peter in Rome. A giant basilica was built on top of the tomb of the first pope in history. And yet, the Bible never mentions any travel of St. Peter to Rome.
It's actually a huge silence that we have. Christian tradition has said that he went to Rome and that he was martyred there, but there's actually no evidence in the Bible for that.
The death of the Prince of the Apostles has been an incredible riddle for 2,000 years. A mystery the Vatican will try to solve in the middle of the 20th century by starting colossal excavations in the depths of the St. Peter Basilica in Rome, in the search for the tomb and relics of St. Peter.
The discovery of the bones was considered absolutely essential for securing Peter's existence in the city.
To confirm that St. Peter came to Rome, tradition uses the tragic tale of his latter days, his arrest during a deadly fire and his death on the cross upside down. But what is actually true in this legend? And what can we learn from the latest historical research on the places Peter has visited? From the place he was martyred to his final resting place, his tomb. In Rome, a couple of meters away from the Antic Forum, the Mamertine prison is one of the oldest places of worship of St. Peter. According to tradition, that's where he spent his last days. He was almost 70 years old. We have to go down to the depths of the prison to discover the bleak cell St. Peter was supposedly kept in, like a descent into hell.
The conditions were awful. Here we can see holes in the walls, and that's because there were chains, and the prisoners were attached to them.
That prison, dug in the ground, is almost 2,700 years old. This is the most famous and most terrible prison of the whole Roman Empire. Prisoners locked in here, in this humid and dirty cell, could stay there for years before dying of cold, hunger or disease. Such a foul fate awaited the worst traitors of the Roman Empire.
This was the prison of the Roman state, the high-security prison for political prisoners. Vercingetorix, the Gallic king, was locked here for more than 6 years before being executed by Caesar.
But what could St. Peter have done to deserve being locked in such a dark prison, reserved for the worst enemies of Rome? The Catholic tradition shows St. Peter's death as something exceptional. Indeed, the Prince of the Apostles was supposedly found guilty of the worst fire Rome had ever known.
The traditional story about Peter's end is that he was taken up in the great fire of Rome.
The story told by Latin historians of that time, along with archaeological excavations, proved that this great fire indeed happened. During the summer of 64 AD, 3/4 of the city went up in smoke. Thousands of Romans died in the flames, amidst total panic.
This fire in Rome has been a trauma. We shouldn't forget it. It almost shook. No, it did shake the authority of Emperor Nero.
Historians today agree more or less that the fire was probably an accident, but at the time, a rumor is spreading in town that the emperor himself set Rome on fire in order to rebuild his ideal city, Neropolis. In order to deflect public discontent and save his power, Nero finds a scapegoat.
In a way to try and deflect blame from himself, Nero said that it was the Christians who'd started the fire.
He scapegoated these Christians, who we are told were already the object of scorn and hatred.
At the end of summer 64 AD, Nero starts one of the first persecutions in history against the Christians. Dozens of men and women are tracked down and arrested. Tradition tells us that St. Peter died during this historical roundup, and that's how he ended up in the Mamertine prison before being executed in such an awful way, along with the other Christians. Indeed, to calm the angry crowd, Nero turns this massacre into a show that thousands of Romans come to see. The emperor even opens up his huge private arena in the Vatican to the public.
There are stories about Christians being put to death on crosses that are then burned, so they're burned alive. So lots and lots of people lost their lives, and it was really very horrible.
According to tradition, St. Peter receives a special punishment, crucifixion. But not like Jesus. Peter asked himself to be attached upside down so as not to die like his master.
The fact he's upside down shows that he doesn't feel worthy of exactly the same kind of death.
This tale about the apostles' martyrdom is essential to the Catholic tradition. The St. Peter Basilica was built upon the ruins of Nero's arena. Yet, only the huge 160 meters high obelisk is left from that monument. At the time, the obelisk was located in the center of Nero's arena, and Peter was allegedly crucified at the foot of this giant monolith. But what is actually true in this tale? St. Peter's death seems very mysterious indeed.
A crucifixion is a spectacular ordeal where one dies because of suffocation. Being crucified upside down has no interest since you die much faster, and the spectacular effect isn't the same. So many historians don't really believe in this upside-down crucifixion business.
And so the legend behind St. Peter's death was perhaps exaggerated. But how much exactly? Did he die in Nero's circus? Was he even arrested during the historical roundup? Some facts are confusing. The persecution of 64 AD is told by Latin historians of that time. Yet St. Peter, the leader of the community, is never mentioned.
He's not mentioned, he's not singled out in the pagan accounts as among those executed.
The mystery deepens when reading the Acts of Peter. This Christian text from the 2nd century tells us a completely different version of the death of the apostle.
It is surprising that the Acts of Peter doesn't mention the fire of Rome. It just has Peter put to death for completely other reasons.
What is this other, completely different version of St. Peter's death? In order to find out, our investigation brings us to the Via Appia, the 500-kilometer-long ancient road that connects Rome to the south of Italy. This is where the final part of the Acts of Peter took place. The text says that St. Peter took the Via Appia in order to escape from Rome. It seems he felt threatened in the capital. But the causes are completely unrelated to the Great Fire of 64.
Peter is persecuted according to the Acts because of the way he had managed to convert a number of high-class Roman citizens to Christianity and was preaching against Roman mores, and particularly was preaching chastity, which of course the upper-class Romans did not like at all.
When, on the Via Appia, the apostle seemed to suddenly change his mind. According to the Acts of Peter, Jesus came to him and convinced him to accept his martyrdom. And so he went back to Rome to give himself up.
The Acts of Peter are interesting for the things that they don't say rather than what they do say.
If we stick to the strict version of the Acts of Peter, the apostle didn't die with the other Christians during the persecution of 64. His execution had been set apart. So could he truly have died in Nero's circus? The Acts of Peter give no clues as to the place of the martyrdom. During the Middle Ages, the mystery regarding this place is so intense that a brand new theory comes up. 1,500 meters away from the Vatican, there's another church asserting that it was built on the site where St. Peter was crucified, San Pietro in Montorio. The King of Spain himself had this magnificent building built in the beginning of the 15th century. He is convinced that St. Peter was executed here rather than in Nero's circus, and it all started from a mysterious Latin word.
The traditional story about Peter's crucifixion says that he was crucified upside down, inter duas metas.
For a long time we translated meta as a boundary marker used to mark the end of the track in an arena which matches the official version. But at the end of the 14th century, researchers highlight that the word meta has another, very different meaning.
They started to re-examine the idea of the meta and found that the word meant a pyramid. They decided that perhaps Peter was not crucified in a circus, but midway between two pyramids.
During St. Peter's time, there were indeed two pyramids in Rome, about 3 kilometers apart. About halfway between them, researchers found a site on the hill of the Janiculum. This is where the San Pietro in Montorio church is built. This other location for St. Peter's martyrdom may seem strange, but at the time, it was a serious candidate. In 1445, the Pope ordered the carving of a representation of the Apostles' martyrdom on the bronze doors of St. Peter's Basilica.
We can see there are two pyramids depicted. We can see Nero condemning Peter for crucifixion, and we can see the cortege snaking up the Janiculum Hill.
This theory that dates back to the end of the Middle Ages cannot be confirmed, of course, but it gives rise to doubt. For 2 millennia, the location of St. Peter's martyrdom has been debated, as it is closely connected to the fate of his relics. Indeed, 1,000 years before, Emperor Constantine used the tale of Nero's arena to state that he had found St. Peter's tomb, and during the 4th century AD, he ordered the construction of the first St. Peter's Basilica.
Constantine, the emperor, seems to have been built over the grave of Peter, or at least that was believed to be the grave of Peter.
Why is Constantine convinced that St. Peter was buried on the hill of the Vatican? Did he truly find the original tomb? To understand how Constantine could locate the tomb of the Apostle, we have to imagine how the Vatican looked at the time of St. Peter. It was a marshy hill outside the city walls. Only Nero's arena was there, a giant building about 590 meters long, where Peter was supposedly executed. During the 4th century, the arena is already in ruins. Yet Emperor Constantine decides to build a giant 8,000-meter square church right next to it, the first St. Peter's Basilica. The construction is an incredible feat of engineering, as the land is incredibly hostile, but Constantine insists on building the church here and nowhere else.
It was a sloping site, it was marshy. If you had free rein over where to build your basilica, you would naturally find a nice flat part of the country to put it in.
The only plausible explanation is that he truly believed that this was where Peter had been buried.
Indeed, the emperor is convinced that St. Peter has been buried exactly here, 100 meters from the supposed location of his execution in the center of Nero's arena. He thinks that St. Peter's body was recovered by the first Christians after his martyrdom, just like Jesus. But no source at St. Peter's time corroborates this. Yet Constantine believes in it, because at the time there was a graveyard next to the arena, a vast necropolis that will have to be buried under the Basilica's foundations. Constantine supposedly kept one single tomb, that of St. Peter. Yet as the centuries went by, the access to this tomb became impossible.
The initial tomb itself completely disappeared under the constructions that came afterwards.
We haven't seen what's down below since the 4th century, and so we can easily imagine that there's nothing there.
During the Renaissance, the very tomb of St. Peter becomes a myth. Some Protestants, such as Luther, declare that there's neither tomb nor relics under the Vatican, because St. Peter never came to Rome.
There is a lot of debate about whether Peter himself died here, so that makes the existence of the bones slightly problematic.
In the 20th century, archaeologists will finally try to solve this 2,000-year-old riddle. To do so, they have to dig right under the basilica in search of St. Peter's tomb, and in doing so, perhaps uncover the precious relics of the Prince of the Apostles.
Of course, nobody really knew what was going to be underneath the basilica, and so really this was opening up to who knows what.
What truly lies under the Basilica in the Vatican, and what can we learn from the analysis carried out on the relics found there? Do these bones truly belong to St. Peter? The history of these extraordinary excavations begins in February 1939, right before World War II.
In 1939, Pope Pius XI dies, and in his will, he asks to be buried as close as possible to the tomb of St. Peter.
The new Pope, Pius XII, will do everything he can to respect the will of his predecessor. On the 28th of June 1939, he orders tricky archaeological excavations that will last 10 years. They have to dig under a 22,000 square meter basilica that could collapse under its own weight at any time.
Digging below St. Peter's Basilica was probably a rather difficult adventure because it could destabilize the building.
The excavations are very secretive, very discreet. People shouldn't know too much about it, and it absolutely couldn't disturb the worship.
7 meters underground, archaeologists unearthed a vast necropolis with many mausoleums, a massive city of the dead buried. So there was indeed a graveyard next to Nero's arena, where the corpses of the Christians executed in the arena could have been buried. Yet the most important archaeological discovery was yet to come.
They find a peculiar arrangement, some kind of small dedicated space within the mausoleums, and against a wall painted red, they find some kind of small monument.
The building is in ruins, but today we're able to reconstruct an image of the original monument. It was a rather simple mausoleum, about 2 to 3 meters high with small columns on the sides. Is this St. Peter's tomb? That's what Emperor Constantine believed during the 4th century in any case, because this building was found right in the center of the first St. Peter's Basilica.
It was treated as a place of pilgrimage to Peter's honor, and that becomes kind of the archaeological seed from which the subsequent basilica grows.
However, the date the monument was built is problematic. It seems to date back to 160 AD, which is 1 century after Peter's death. Could this building truly be a tomb? Or is it rather a symbolic funeral monument built to worship St. Peter? To prove that it is indeed his tomb, archaeologists looked for bones inside the monuments, but they didn't find any. So where do the relics shown by Pope Francis in 2013 come from? Three years after the excavations ended in 1953, the quest for St. Peter's relics takes a new, unexpected turn, thanks to the perseverance of researcher Margherita Guarducci.
She believes the tomb is authentic, and she convinces the Pope that they need to undertake new excavations, which she'll be in charge of.
Margherita Guarducci studies the walls around the monument. They're covered with strange writings. At first glance, they look like simple lines, but in truth, they're a code used by the first Christians.
The graffiti have largely eroded. They're incomplete, but the scraps that we have mention his name and, "Oh, Peter, pray for me," or something like that.
She's able to identify the sign for St. Peter that the first Christians carved. This is a P with a cross. The 2 lines below represent the keys that are associated with him, but there's no mention of any relics. However, everything will change when analyzing a fragment of the wall lying on the ground close to the tomb. The writings aren't complete, but what she does decipher will give her the solution to the mystery of the relics.
She reads Petros Eni, which means Peter is inside, and so she's convinced that his bones are indeed here.
Margherita Guarducci is convinced that the bones are inside the wall she's been studying for months, and where the sign of Peter has been carved several times. She then investigates the archaeological work carried out during the 1940s and discovers something amazing. 10 years ago, bones were actually found in a hole inside the wall, but the team of archaeologists didn't pay them much attention since they were outside the tomb they targeted.
Where have the bones been stored? Nobody really knows anymore. So she does some more research and ends up finding the box in a cupboard.
Margherita Guarducci discovers several bone fragments along with dirt and what's left of golden threads. During antiquity, important people were buried like that, wrapped in gold-threaded clothes. The bones are handed over to an independent laboratory to be analysed, and the conclusions seem promising.
Anthropological studies confirm that they're all bones from the same man, a sturdy person, rather old.
Everything seems to fall into place. Peter was a fisherman, so he was probably sturdy. And the man is estimated to have been around 70 years old when he died, which is about Peter's age. This is the perfect epilogue for the Vatican. In 1964, Pope Paul VI, who took over after Pius XII, announces officially that the tomb and relics of St. Peter have been found again. But Margherita Guarducci's investigation is soon questioned. The story of a box laid aside for years sounds suspicious. How did the bones end up inside the wall? And what happened between Peter's death and the construction of the funeral monument during the 2nd century?
What we can say is that this monument was probably built to shelter Peter's bones. But concluding that the bones found there are his would mean that nothing has changed, that the bones haven't moved.
We know that the hole where the bones were found has been opened before. Medieval coins were discovered there, and the skeleton is incomplete. Is it possible that some bones were taken and brought somewhere else? This would match the story of the relics in Santa Maria in Capella, the church in Rome where peculiar urns were unearthed in 2014. Archaeological analysis carried out here tells us that Pope Urban II brought the bones here during the 11th century.
At the time, Urban II still had access to St. Peter's original tomb. So it's quite possible that he took part of the bones and transferred them here, in a church that he owned.
The story of a pope who would desecrate the tomb of the Prince of the Apostles seems incredible. Yet, during the Middle Ages, the relics were so important that this theory makes sense.
It's not so surprising that a pope would go ahead and dismember the body of a saint. The Church has forbidden this only recently. During the Middle Ages, it was common practice.
The various historical clues seem to indicate that St. Peter's bones are indeed in Rome, but only DNA and carbon-14 analysis could confirm their authenticity. Until now, the Vatican has always refused it. A change of position could lead in the future to new developments in the quest for St. Peter's relics, a quest that has been going on through the centuries and continues.